the home of all art is the human mind and heart, right? Like, who cares if it's hanging on the wall if nobody ever sees it, right? Who cares if the perfect note is sung if it never echoes inside another human, right?
Welcome to Growing Inspiration, the podcast that nurtures your passion for the arts and creativity. I'm your host, Shana McLean, and I'm thrilled to take you on this delightful journey through the vibrant world of arts and culture. In each episode, you can expect engaging interviews with a diverse range of artistic and creative individuals. We'll delve into what inspires them, explore their unique creative processes, and discover how their art enriches their lives. Together, we'll uncover the beauty of literature, the performing arts, the visual arts, food, wine, and spirits, and the inspiration gained through travel. Whether you're a connoisseur or just beginning your exploration, our conversations will inspire you to deepen your understanding and appreciation of the arts. So get ready to discover new perspectives, spark your creativity, and join a community of fellow art lovers. Welcome back to another episode of the Growing Inspiration podcast. I'm your host, Shana McLean. I'm so excited for you to meet today's guest. I met Carey Wallace a couple of years ago at a writing workshop inspired by the works of Madeleine L'Engle. Carey is a visual artist and songwriter and has spoken on art, faith, and justice with students at Princeton, Juilliard, Emory, Pratt, and Yale. Her articles and poems have appeared in Time, Detroit's Metro Times, and America. She is the founder of a retreat for artists in Michigan, as well as the creative discipline class that forms Strong Creative Habits, which has been in operation for over a decade across the U.S. and internationally. Carey is the author of 5 books, and we will discuss her newest book today. It is titled The Discipline of Inspiration, The Mysterious Encounter with God at the Heart of Creativity. One of my key aims on this show is to explore the origins and sources of inspiration and creativity, so Carey's book was right up my alley and gave me so much to think about. We really only scratched the surface in today's episode, so please check out Carey's book for yourself. I'll put the links in the show notes. It's a pleasure to welcome Carey Wallace to the show. Hi, Carey. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Shana, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here today.
So I'm so excited to be able to talk about your new book, The Discipline of Inspiration. There are so many things that I love, so many of these themes that I love to think about as a writer and a knowledge seeker myself. And so I'm really excited to dive in. My own copy across the desk has tons of book darts and underlines and so forth. But before we get into all of that, could I gave the listeners a little bit of an idea of your bio, your background at the top of the show, but could you tell us kind of where you are in space and time and kind of what's happening in your life right now?
So in space and time, I am currently outside of Chicago, in the northern suburbs of Chicago, sort of right between Chicago and Milwaukee. Actually, it's pretty far north. And what's going on in my life is that this book just came out, so that's a full-time job. So yeah. I've been talking to people and writing to people, and just doing everything I can to share the ideas into the world.
So. Right. Could you also tell us a little bit, about the book? Set the stage before I dive into the meaty themes that I want to get into.
Sure. So the book emerged as I was starting a program for artists to create strong creative habits. So much of the programming that we do is designed to teach us craft, or is designed to teach us how to think about art if we're not creating things. But what I wanted to give people was a habit of making things, right? The discipline of creation, basically. And as I was working on that, I wanted to have a curriculum that was purely based on things that other artists had actually said about art, like artists that I respect and other people might also respect. And very few of the people who I think have been most meaningful in the history of art have actually sat down and written an entire book about art. They've mostly talked to their friends or answered questions in interviews. So I was looking through biographies, old copies of the Paris Review, copies of Rolling Stone, looking through books on songwriting by songwriters, dancers on dance, all that kind of stuff. And I was looking across genres, thinking about it as art writ large, all the things that we kind of stereotypically think of as art forms. And what I found in that was that I was interested in a whole slew of of topics there. I was interested in the artist's character. Do you have to be a jerk, right? The artist's life. Do you have to be unhappy? These are, sort of myths that are really persistent through time into the present day. The purpose of art, the definition of art. We have a special guest. This is my dog Bandit lying down in the background. And what I found was that people just radically disagreed, like great artists radically disagreed, and sometimes are diametrically opposed on really significant topics. And none of us who are not Tolstoy or Toni Morrison really have the credibility to decide which one of them is right, if they're not agreeing with each other. But so I was especially interested when I discovered that there was one place that almost everybody seemed to agree on, and that was the experience of inspiration, which I define as something distinct from two other things that are really crucial in art. So I think there are three key ingredients in art. One is talent, just how easy it is to sing in tune or to draw a human face, right? And the other is technique, which is how much time you spend running scales or standing in front of a canvas, honing that talent into something, that's got more precision and more sophistication and that can be summoned more easily. But I think anybody who has been in the art world or read about the art world or thought much about it realizes that the most talented people and the people with the most technique are not always making the best or the most interesting art, because there is a third ingredient, which is what I describe as inspiration, which is what tells the singer how to sing. It tells the songwriter what to write. And without that, even large amounts of talent or technique don't really add up to much. And when artists talk about inspiration, talk about the moment of inspiration, they all agreed. And they all agreed that it was something that felt like it came from beyond them, something that felt like it was even sometimes at odds with who they actually were, that did things that surprised them, led them in directions they did not personally think they wanted to go, that took and that if they did not respond to it, would go to someone else. So it's sort of this gift that is gonna, when it comes to you, that's your chance. And if you don't do it, it might go someplace else. And different people describe this at different places over and over again. And not everybody describes it as a visitation from God, but universally, people use religious language to describe it, even if what they need to say is, it feels divine, but it can't possibly be. It must, let me reach for some other explanation. But they have to at least deny the possibility that it might be from something beyond us, because the sensation of it being from beyond us and coming from an actual personality beyond us is so strong. And so I got very interested in that idea and thinking, well, what if we just accept this testimony of all these artists, which is echoed by, in the Christian scriptures, the very beginning of the Gospel of John says, through God, all things were created. Without God, nothing was created that has been created. And we simply don't believe that. Those of us who are Christians rarely actually believe that, right? We draw actually a very bright line between what we think God created and what we create. And sometimes with good reason, right? And I think you can get into, and I do get into in the book, what it means to create, and is everything that is made art, is everything that is made by human hands actually created? Are those two different categories of behavior? So I think there's a lot to play with and think about there. I don't think it's simple, but I think it is the testimony both of the artists and in the sort of sacred text that I look to myself. There's often not a lot of agreement between those places. So it got my attention that this was a place where artists who couldn't agree agreed, and where it did resonate with sort of larger spiritual practice throughout the world. So I started thinking, where can we arrive if we believe this testimony from all these different places? How would it change how we think about what is and isn't art? How would it change how we think about who is and isn't an artist? How would it change how we think about ourselves when we make things, when we encounter art, those transcendent experiences we have around art? Maybe that's not an illusion. Maybe that is a connection with God. If it is a connection with God, what does that tell us about God? What does that tell us about us in relationship to God? So it was just such a fruitful set of big questions that I thought, let's explore all of these in this book. And so that is what I did.
So how did you keep from kind of going down the rabbit hole on some of those? Did you have to kind of pull yourself back from the philosophical deep dive to be able to put the book together, or were you able to just give yourself the time to explore all of those things over time and then be able to put it back together into the book?
Yeah, I went down all the trails all the way. So and then I did go back. I mean, there was a degree to which these things, there's a circularity to it, right? So it's this giant, it's kind of like ball of string, and I had to figure out how to make it into a linear thing that you could read from beginning to end without feeling like you were running into repetition all the time, but also without feeling like you were reading a bunch of discrete things that didn't connect with each other at all. But yeah, I followed all the trails that I could think of to the end with this. And it's actually kind of delightful as it comes out in the world to discover that other people, when they encounter the ideas, often find a trail that I haven't found. But it's a very fruitful set of ideas, as I was saying, not just for me, but for other people who encounter them.
Right, right. And so one of the deepest themes in the book that really resonated with me was the idea of inspiration becoming incarnate through the artist, and then also through the mind of the audience. And that's one thing, you and I met at one of the Lingo writing retreats a couple of years ago, Madeline Lingo writing retreats. And one of the things that she talks a lot about in her book, Walking on Water, is that we are meant to be co-creators with God and giving birth to that gift or the call. And so what you were saying really just brought that all back to mind. And I love the way that you explained and dove into that idea of incarnation. I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit more for us.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the questions that you have, if we accept this idea that inspiration comes from God, then one of the immediate questions is, why doesn't it all come in the language of the angels or in whatever language God actually speaks, right? Why doesn't it appear in a way that is pure and unadulterated and very easily distinguishable as art and nothing else, because it's only in the language of art, right? And that's not the case. Like, art actually is very, very deeply embedded in the culture that surrounds us. Like, we use the ideas, the shape of our society, our own friendships, our own families, like all of these things flow into all of our art forms. And we even speak almost always, when we write poetry or when we sing, we're almost always doing that in the language that our mother spoke to us, right? So there's so why is that? And I think there's a lot of interesting questions around that. I think one of the things that indicates is, or one of the things that may indicate, is God's delight in all the different human cultures and what has already been created by human hands, or other, the history of inspiration through time, what is left behind becomes the home for inspiration once again. So that's on sort of like the biggest kind of meta level. I also think that there is what I describe as a cascade of inspiration, right? So, and it comes through various people at various times. So the first place that, let's say, if you go to a concert, the first place that inspiration appears for that concert is in the mind of the composer, right? And so the composer gets something that doesn't even have any, whatever sounds the composer has in their mind to attach to it, right? And they put it down on paper in some form that can be translated to other musicians. And then each of those musicians takes that spark of inspiration, which comes in part as direction to them. But what it is telling them usually is just what notes to play and for how long. And there's a whole other world of, how do I, what sort of feeling, what sort of tone do I put into this? How does that relate to what I'm hearing around me from my fellow performers, from the audience, right? And some of that is technique, but I also believe that inspiration is like a profound part of performance, not just composition. And I also believe that each member of an audience then, to a certain degree, performs a book, performs a play, performs a concert by opening themselves up to it, by making room for it in themselves, and by, when they hear a word, it's easiest to talk about kind of with words, but I think this is also true with gestures and colors and and sounds and things that are much more difficult to put into words, which is why we put them into something that's not words. But when you say, when a person on stage says tree, right? Or when a book on the page says tree, everybody has a different tree that they put into that place, right? So everybody is to some degree performing the play or writing the book alongside the authors, the other authors and the other performers of that work. And I see that as kind of a beautiful cascade of inspiration that can go out into the world and can also then spark other acts of creation, right? So does that answer the question?
Yes. And I just love that idea that when we don't have to be creating the art from scratch ourselves, but just by sitting in the audience, we are creating that piece inside our minds and our own souls. And then that impacts us and impacts the way that we then go out into the world and share whatever we felt about that. It kind of, like you said, a cascade that, goes through the artist and then the audience and then so forth. And it's a wonderful way to think about it all being connected, that we are all, connected to each other and to the creation in that way. And
yeah. And to some extent, like the home of all art is the human mind and heart, right? Like who cares if it's hanging on the wall if nobody ever sees it, right? Who cares if the perfect note is sung if it never echoes inside another human, right? You can make an argument that it's worth it to make things for the artists themselves, right? That they can be their own echo chamber. And I think sometimes we do create things because we need an answer to a question, or because we need healing, or we need all kinds of things that art can offer us. So I'm not saying that work is of no value if you never find an audience for it, but I'm saying that the place where it really exists is within humans. So.
Right. And then toward the end of the book, after you've discussed quite a lot about inspiration, what is art, and what is perhaps not art, and so forth, you talk about spiritual disciplines that can help a person develop a way of listening for the inspiration. And one of the ones that resonated with me the most was the discipline of attention. And that's something that has come to me in various forms recently. I'm a big fan of Mary Oliver's poetry, and there's one in which she gives instructions for a life that, pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. And even Brother Lawrence, a Carmelite monk, who talked about he didn't pray anymore. He just paid attention, and that was his constant communion with God. So I love that idea of the discipline. And then how does that open us more to inspiration and then to surrender, which is kind of, I think, what your ultimate goal in the book is, to be able to gain access to the inspiration.
Yeah. So if we take seriously the idea that God is speaking in the form of inspiration, then the fundamental gesture to receive it is surrender, right? And so when I started wondering how can I as an artist welcome more of this in my life, I realized what I wanted to do is get better at surrender, which is sort of an absurd thing to want to do. But it's also something that we have no training for in Western culture. Like all of our culture is about thinking harder and trying harder and clenching and controlling and then maybe kind of like repairing ourselves on the weekend with like expensive self-care options, right? And but I was like, how do you actually let go? How do you welcome something bigger than yourself? What trains me to do this? And what I realized was that my spiritual practices, and I don't want to hold myself up as like any kind of example of somebody who has like been really great at doing spiritual practices, but I realized that the spiritual practices that I had been doing, kind of piecemeal and probably poorly, had actually been the things in my life that had most shaped me to be able to welcome the spirit of inspiration as an artist. And those spiritual disciplines appear across the major world religions, that things like silence and solitude, fasting, community, prayer, worship. And there's like a dozen of them. I never know all of them at the same time off the top of my head. But I'm never sure whether there's a dozen of them or slightly more. But So that got me very interested in, how the spiritual disciplines could map onto the life of the artist. So that is sort of the closing part of the book. So you're walking us through the early part of the book, talks about inspiration. The middle part talks about incarnation, and then the final part is discipline. And what we're talking about is the spiritual disciplines and how they can apply to the life of an artist. And the conclusion that I eventually come to actually is that if we welcome inspiration in any part of our life, it can become an art form, and therefore anybody can be an artist. So I deeply believe that this is for everybody. And I deeply believe both that everybody has these creative impulses. They may be very held down, denied, impossible to answer for lots of different reasons. I believe that. I believe that people do want to write poems. I believe that people wake up with music in their head that they have never heard before, that they don't even know how to write down. So I believe this happens in what we think of as the arts, right? But I also believe, and this is already encoded in our language, that anything can be an art form when we welcome inspiration into it. And we already say that, like if somebody is really good at barbecue, we're like, oh, that guy's an artist, right? So we can see how anything can be elevated to this when we welcome the spirit in. And you were asking specifically about attention. I mean, I think every single one of these comes back to surrender. They're all like, and I think attention is a way that we reckon with what is here, and a way that we open ourselves up to it. And that when we do that with just what is right around us, right, then we can shape ourselves to do that with things that are much more difficult to let in, right? So it can be really terrifying to be like, God might talk to me, right? And it can be really, it can also be wonderful, right? There are all kinds of things, but there could be a lot of, I think, actually really justifiable questions, and just a sense of, this has some weight to it if there might be a divine encounter here, right?
Right.
So with attention, we don't start with that necessarily, right? We start with, what does my room look like right now? Like, what do I usually not see? And what can I see just where I am? And then you can take that different places. You can do it on the bus. You can do it in places that are beautiful. You can do it in places that are not beautiful, and discover that actually there's a lot of beauty there. I actually think one of the things I really like to do is just see, I actually feel a little weepy about this, like how much beauty there is in every human face. And there's so much evil in the world telling us, men and women, that we're not beautiful, that only certain people are beautiful, that even those people aren't beautiful enough, right? But each human face has got so much beauty, and so much more than beauty to it. So you can kind of go from looking at everything that's in a violet to the master class of the human face, right? And that shapes us to be able to, first of all, recognize God in those very simple things, because there's a lot of evidence that is what God comes into the world in, right? Again, the Christian story is God comes in the form of a poor boy, right, to the world. And the things that he leaves behind are a tradition of eating bread and drinking wine, these very, very simple elements that have this incredible potency as God comes into them. So both human flesh and those elements. And I know there are differences across Protestants and Catholics in terms of like how we interpret exactly what's going on there. But everyone believes that to some degree God is present in the moments that we do these very simple things. And I think from there, sometimes we're taken into really vast places beyond what we can see where we are by paying attention to what is in front of us. Allows us to start paying attention to things that are just beyond us, right? And then things that are even farther beyond us than those things. And they can take us places we would never get to if we didn't have that discipline of paying attention.
Right. And you touched on something with regard to if we feel that inspiration, if we let ourselves kind of believe or kind of even have a glimpse that inspiration is coming from God, that we kind of shy away from that in some cases, because that does imply a bit of an imperative, like that we have been given this thing to do something with, and that there is a fear of messing it up, or is this really God? And like, how do we how would you discern? Like, what is a good way to talk about that discernment aspect of, is this really God, and should I really do something with it, and what should I do?
Well, I think it's really interesting to, I got to this by reading artists who are not necessarily of any religious background using religious language to talk about this. And one of the things that was really sad to me was that to a large extent, artists who had a religious background were much less likely. They were equally likely to be like, yeah, it feels like that, but they really felt a need to bracket it and be like, but no, it couldn't be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or to be like, well, did God write this terrible play? Did God give ideas to this very questionable pop star? And but again, everybody's having that same experience, right? And it made me sad that the people who felt like they knew God best were least willing to ascribe these like extraordinary experiences and these beautiful things that come out of them to God, right? It's like, why are we avoiding giving God the credit there? And it's because a lot of it's out of respect to some degree. Some of it's a healthy reference, and some of it's just recognition that like a lot of human production is not art; it's garbage. And if we don't draw some lines between those things, we risk ascribing stuff to God that would be an insult to God, right?
Right.
But I do think one of the practices that I didn't mention is discernment, right? And I think that is done through a whole host of ways. So I think that you can compare what you have, if you're wondering whether you have or have not made art, right? You can listen to what other people have to say. They don't always know, right? But you can, there's a lot of pieces that you can take in. One is any voice. One is trusted voices, right? One is just your own ability to compare what you've made to things that you've made before that were definitely art, or things that you've seen other people make that were definitely art in your opinion. None of it's ever going to be one-to-one, right? Because if you were making something identical to somebody else, it would be manufacturing and not art.
Right.
So it's a place where I think, just like in faith, we have to have an enormous tolerance for uncertainty, even as we take decisive, like truly decisive action in the creation of art. And I also think that both we will never know whether we have made art or not, and also we definitively know, right? Without being able to prove it, we know what our best things are. We know the things that have come from beyond us in a different way than anything else has. And we know that those are the things that people respond to, right? Like the things that are sort of most our babies, the things that we like cry and think and spend years, on are often not the things that resonate the most with the world, right? It's often the things that come through inspiration, the things that to some degree, enormous amount of effort might be devoted to that original vision. An enormous amount of inspiration might come through in the course of all that effort. But we also know that sometimes it's the things that seem most effortless and seem less like us that are actually the things that seem to be the biggest gifts to both us and the world. And I do think that that's because they come from God.
Right. And there was an illustration that you gave in the book about how law enforcement doesn't learn how to identify counterfeit money by looking at the counterfeits. They identify it by looking at the real thing and understanding how that feels and looks.
Yep.
And by spending more time with real art, we can become more accustomed to what is truly inspired.
Yeah. And I think also we can do that with a little bit of skepticism of the people who think they're in charge of telling us what is and is not real art, right? Because I think that there's like a whole industry devoted to telling us, we should be really impressed with this person. And I think if we're not, we should listen to that, right? Because the history of art is a history of people being wrong about what is the most important thing happening at this moment. Like, I think I also mentioned in the book that St. Matthew's Passion, by Bach, which nobody agrees on what is the best piece of music ever written. But if there was something that more people agree on than any other piece, it is likely that work. The year that it came out, it was not, it's a Easter, it's basically like an Easter play, right? And the year that it came out, everybody went to see some other guy in the same town who had written a different, so like the people at that time, if you were trying to learn what art was from the people who wanted to tell you that at that point in history, you would have missed the best thing going, maybe in history. Right. So I think also that knowing what we know, like, there are a lot of people who have thought deeply, who are really generous in like welcoming people into art and understanding more about it. I think you are one of those people, right? So I'm not saying there's no value in having guides and curators and people who devote their lives to helping other people come into the work of others, right? The people who do this work are often not even doing it on behalf of their own creations, right? There's something really generous and wonderful about it. But I also think they can become dictators.
Right. If you are the gatekeeper, then you're obviously keeping something out. So
exactly. Yeah. So I think going ahead and saying, I don't really like that one. I know everybody else does, but I don't really like it. And letting your own taste and your own sort of antenna for inspiration guide you is wonderful. And I also think it's very interesting to let it guide you beyond what you think you like, right? Like to not become a dictator yourself according to your oh, well, I know what I like and I'm never going to the opera because the opera is like not for me, right? But to keep trying things and then keep sort of like honoring your own reactions to those things.
Right. And what your gut and your soul are telling you about a particular piece and how you feel about it. Great.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, I know you teach a class on creative discipline, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that class. Is it still ongoing? Is it still something that you're bringing people into, and how's it going and how long does it take and that sort of thing?
So it's called the Creative Discipline class, and you can actually go to the website, disciplineofinspiration.org, and sign up to hear about the next class that I hope will happen in the spring. And they're 90-day classes. And the whole point of the class is to create a creative habit that will last through the rest of your life, right? So instead of learning technique or how to refine a story, it's like, how do you find time in your daily life to make stuff on a regular basis? And I've had people in this class do everything from spend every Saturday morning to spend an hour a day to carving out 15 to 20-minute blocks of breaks in their life as a biochemist, right? To write a children's book. So it's really about finding what works for you, but finding something that will allow you to have a practice, even if nobody ever anoints you as an artist and tells you you can make art for the rest of your life and somebody will pay you for that, which happens to basically zero people now, right? So if we want to be makers, and if we ever want to get to the point where somebody might do that kind of anointing of us, we need to have a long-term habit of creation long before anybody else really encourages us to do that. And when we have that, we can have, it can be a fruitful, wonderful, and I think a spiritual discipline actually that carries us through life. And it's not meant to be like, well, what I'm going to do is 1 hour a day for the rest of all time. It's meant to be like, in this group of people, we will talk about the habits we're creating. We'll talk about what has been working for us and what has been working for others. And we will learn how to create a flexible habit, but one that can persist through all kinds of seasons of our lives. So, and they say, there's a lot of different research on habits, but it takes between 30 and 90 days to create a habit. It's a 90-day program. It meets every other week, and it's very simple. All we do is say you make a commitment to the group in 1 week of what you're going to do over the next couple of weeks. And then you talk about whether you did it or not. And then you make your commitment based on what was working and what didn't work for the following weeks. And one of the other things we know about habits is that they work much better when they are formed in community. So this is an attempt to form that in community so that people can carry it through their lives when they don't have an artistic community to carry them along.
Right. And that's another thing that, I could keep picking out things in your book that just like, oh, I love that. And I love that. And I love that. One of the things I really appreciated was what you said about not leaving our real lives to create art, that we don't have to take ourselves apart from what we have built, in our careers and our family and so forth, just to be artists and to be creators. I think that's a very healthy way to look at it, as opposed to, what some people do.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's actually really important. We need to be nurtured by our communities. Our communities need us. Our communities need our art, right? And yeah, and the degree to which we are taking artists out of the spaces that nurture them and keep them accountable, and know them as something other than an artist, know them as something other than a star, know them as a brother or a friend, or just like that annoying guy down the hall, right? It's really good to have those identities and not just like capital G, capital A, great artist, right? I don't think that's a good place for anybody to create from. So yeah, I really passionately believe that it needs to happen in the context of daily life. And I also really care about us getting to hear voices from all different parts of the world and all different parts of society. And the reality is there's only a handful of people who have the sort of the privilege to keep making art all the time and have that be the only thing that they do, right? So the vast majority of us need to find a way to do that within full-time jobs or more than one full-time job, families, things that have lots of like real duties and demands on them. And I do believe it's possible to create in those contexts. And I want to hear from the people who are in those contexts and not the people who are out in this rarefied club of artists who are out in residencies and retreats. And, I'd like to hear from the people who are embedded in real lives. So.
Right. So what's up next for you? I mean, you've got this huge book launch that you're wading through right now. Do you have another project that's coming up?
So the book launch is all consuming for the moment, and it will involve me doing writing, articles and things to support the book. So I'll be playing with these ideas probably for the early part of the year. And then I'm thinking about, actually writing some fiction again, hopefully sometime in the summer. And I'm just letting that, I'm waiting for inspiration to give me, I have ideas, right? but I'm sort of waiting to see what really emerges as the idea that has the most life behind it. So
Great. We'll look forward to that. And something I'm asking all of my guests, who is the most creative person that you can think of, person or group, and why would you say that about them?
So the most creative, I don't know, one person who springs to mind for me there is a person named B.L. Sherrill, who is a rapper and also a co-founder and a leader of a record label called Freer Records, which puts out music by people who were incarcerated or are currently incarcerated, which is even more difficult to record. And she is a really extraordinary artist herself, but she is also a scrappy, gritty entrepreneur, and she uses all of that on behalf of other people's creativity, and on behalf of creativity that would likely never be unleashed or would never be heard by anyone else. Or beyond a very small circle if she was not devoting her life, despite her own considerable talents and all the things she herself has to say. She's spending an enormous amount of time, getting other people's voices heard. And to me, that's sort of the most profoundly creative thing that you can do, especially when it, to some degree, it both feeds and competes with our own work when we try to, we all only get so many hours in a day and so many minutes in those hours. And so I think to make choices to release the creativity of others when you feel like you have a creative path of your own is a real gift. And I think she is one of the people who I've seen do that with the most energy and sacrifice. So,
wow.
Yeah, great. But you can look up Freer Records. There's a whole bunch of great stuff there.
Okay, awesome. We'll link to that in the show notes.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Carey. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today, and good luck with your book launch. And I will look forward to seeing how your new project takes shape, perhaps over the next couple of years, whatever inspiration tells you.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the time, and thank you for spending your time with me and the book.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of Growing Inspiration. I hope you found today's conversation as inspiring as I did. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment to subscribe and share it with your friends. To dive deeper into the world of arts and creativity, visit my website at gardenofmydelights.com for exclusive content and resources, including show notes. Don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter for the latest updates and insights. You can also connect with me on Instagram for more inspiration at Garden of My Delights. Until next time, keep nurturing your creativity and looking for beauty and wisdom all around you.